Today, it's my pleasure, and with some sadness too, I take the opportunity to dedicate this lecture today to the memory of a past member and past president, Anne Chisholm. Anne was born in Dartmouth and spent a lot of her childhood in Tangier and then into Halifax. Anne achieved a Bachelor of Science in Home Economics from Macdonald College, McGill. And Anne lived and worked in Ontario, and then often as an entrepreneur, is my impression. Anne and her husband returned to Nova Scotia soon built a house at Butler's Point on St. Margaret's Bay. You may think that at this point, Anne would put up her feet and rest a bit. Maybe breathe the salt air and just relax. Well, apparently not, because it seems that that's not within her nature. Anne's style was to support and enhance events in her local community. And for example, she helped establish the Peggy's Cove and Area Festival of the Arts, which has become quite a well-known destination in Nova Scotia and even some parts of the US. That then, being a lifelong learner, like many of you at home, Anne joined SCANS around 2019, where she contributed to our organization and in a number of ways. Part of it at the time, she was on the coordination committee, which is one of our big committees. I don't know how much you know about the organization of SCANS, but the coordination committee organizes the talks, the lectures, the venues, and much, much more. And then Anne ended up as serving as president from 2022 and 2023. That said, that places her, I hope, within a boundary for you to understand who she was, where she came from. Today, there are those joining us on Zoom, as well as you who are in the room, who will have fond memories of Anne as a kind and vibrant woman who achieved much. It is such memories that we hold dear, and we share and keep Anne alive through our memories. So I'd like to leave that with you today. An accomplished woman, a woman who's missed by many. And thank you for your time. And I'll pass you back to Margie.
Thank you, Helen. I'd now like to introduce our speaker. We all experience grief every day, all the time, and it's many, many, many forms. So today we're going to explore the concept of grief literacy, which will help us deal with our own grief and help us support others who are grieving. Our speaker is Mary Ellen Macdonald. Spencer spells her name with a small d. It's very, very important in this world. And she has been a treat to deal with. We've been corresponding over the last several months, and we have a very good time. I finally just met her today, and she has also come very, very highly recommended. She has a PhD in, guess what, anthropology, and she's a professor in the palliative medicine department at Dell. She's particularly interested and passionate about supporting death and grief literacy across the diverse communities of our province. So please join me in welcoming Mary Ellen.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Am I on? Yeah, wow, this is a tough act to follow, hearing about Anne. That was really beautiful. I never met her, but I feel like I got a little piece of who she was. So thank you for that. And it's really touching to be here, especially with that tribute. So I'm thrilled to be spending the afternoon with you and everyone who's at home on Zoom. This talk is about understanding how grief is universal to the human experience, and how grief literacy can be a strategy for making space for grief in our lives and in our communities. And clearly, SCANS is a community, so I feel like I'm in the right place. Oh dear, here, I might be in the right place. There we go. Now, I'll start with an invitation to you all. Please go at this topic on your own pace. I fundamentally believe that we need to be talking about grief in public, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And it doesn't mean that it can stay academic, because when we talk about grief, we feel. And the whole point of grief literacy is to invite grief into all of our social spaces, to stop pushing grief to the side, keeping it in the closet, keeping it at home when we leave the house. It's about acknowledging that as humans, we will all experience grief, and probably multiple times. So please, go at your own, are we okay? No. Go at your own pace. Tune me out if you need to. Get up, walk around, put in some headphones if you've had enough. That's completely fine. With grief, we need to go at our own pace. So this talk is about acknowledging that we all carry grief and that we all can do better to support the grief in our own lives and in the grief that might be sitting right next to us on the bus, in the library, at the grocery store, in the movie theater, or right here today. Now, we've already had a land acknowledgement, which was beautiful. Our topic today is grief, and one does not have to do more than scratch the surface of a land acknowledgement to find the need for grief literacy. So much of the Indigenous history has been about loss of land, loss of culture, loss of language, loss of people. And whenever you have loss, you have grief. And a key part of grief literacy is learning to think about the grief that might be hidden by our privilege. The whole idea of hidden grief is really important to grief literacy. So as citizens that are interested in grief, interested in caring about grief, we need to be continually asking, how is my privilege preventing me from seeing grief around me? That's the first lesson in grief literacy for today. Now, a second place that grief hides is within issues of sex and gender. My pronouns are she and her. Now, when a person transitions from one gender identity to another, they sometimes refer to their old name and their old identity as their dead name, because something has died and something is being reborn. Now, that dead name and dead identity can be mourned, especially by the friends and family who knew that past identity and that past name. And also through the whole process, there can be a lot of stigma for the person who is transitioning. And grief can then follow when they lose the family and friends who didn't go with them through the transition. So living a stigma, we know, can be very lonely. And when grief is compounding that stigma, it's that much more lonely. So this is our second lesson today about grief literacy. Grief literacy here is another opportunity to think about grief in our local worlds. So here's a quick outline of what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes. We're going to start with an overview. What is this thing I'm calling grief? And then we're going to look a little bit more closely at grief literacy, this social movement. And then I'm going to finish by providing some ways to help us respond to grievers in our midst. So it's important to make sure we're all on the same page. What is grief? And this might sound like a simple question, but I've been thinking about this question for 2 decades. I don't think it's simple at all, which when you're a researcher, that's a good problem. Now, before we dig too deeply into this question, I'd like to do a quick exercise. Let's find out who's in the room today and also on Zoom at home. My caveat here with this exercise is do not feel you need to disclose anything you don't want to disclose, okay? You need to feel comfortable with this. So the exercise is, if you feel comfortable, please raise your hand if you agree with a statement that I'm going to read. And once it's up, leave it up, okay? Okay, so here are the statements. Put your hand up if I have grieved or I am grieving the death or the loss of a grandparent. I can put my hand up for that. I have grieved or I am grieving the death or the loss of a parent. I have grieved or I'm grieving the death or loss of a spouse. Now, it could be the death, but it could also be through divorce. You can grieve a spouse through divorce. So keep your hands up. So I've grieved or I'm grieving the death or the loss of another family member. Maybe I'm estranged from them, or maybe they died. I have grieved or I'm grieving the death or loss of an animal, maybe a pet or a companion animal, the death or loss of a friend, the loss of a body part, maybe through surgery that I'm grieving. I've lost a sense of myself and I'm grieving it, my autonomy, my independence, my ability to walk, feel secure in public. I have grieved or I'm grieving the loss of something dear to me. Maybe I lost it through a hurricane or a fire or a theft. Leave your hands up, everyone who had their hands up. Now, please, and everyone on Zoom, bear with us. Look around the room. Okay, you can put your hands down. I mean, clearly the point of that was to kind of express how vast grief is and how we share something in this room. We might not know each other, but we already know that we share something. And that is the power of grief literacy, to point out how we share grief. So let's go back to our question. What is grief? So on the one hand, it's quite simple. It's the experience of loss. Archaeologists have found graves thousands of years old that show that humans have been caring for their dead for millennia. And when you care, you feel something. But grief is not just about experiencing the death of a human, right? That's called bereavement when you experience the death of a human. It's bigger than bereavement, right? Because you can grieve the death of an animal. You can also grieve all kinds of losses. So grief is central to being human because humans live in the present and we move into the future, which means we're always losing our past. Really, to live is to lose. The moment we're born, we lose something. We lose the warmth and the safety of the womb. Now, we don't have a conscious memory of this, but grief doesn't require conscious memory. A baby who is relinquished for adoption then experiences the loss of a mother. Obviously, that mother has experienced a major loss as well. And that baby then lives their whole life with the loss of what could have been. Not to say they don't have a lovely life that they're living, but they're still grieving what could have been. Young children continue to learn about loss when their favorite toy goes missing. Older children learn new losses when a best friend moves away, the goldfish dies, the hamster dies, grandma dies. And then we pile on to these experiences other losses. Our parents get divorced. We lose our homeland when we migrate. Many will have experienced losses that come with illness, death of siblings, parents, spouses, grandparents, friends, work colleagues. And then there's aging. With aging comes all kinds of losses that we feel deeply. As we age, we retire and we lose our work identity. We lose our health, our mobility, our independence. Our social networks shrink as we get older. Aging can be seeped through with losses too, because we lose so much of our kind of bodily, our idea of who we are. So even things like as our muscles get smaller, we're unable to walk, things like that. And these losses can lead us into isolation, which lead us into loneliness. And this is all then compounded with grief. Grief and loneliness can be mutually reinforcing. So really, to live is to lose, and that's just a fact. But we're not really good at integrating these kinds of facts into our outlooks, into our ways of life, into our conversations, and importantly, into our social and political policies. And that is where this movement called grief literacy is really incredibly important. And I will come back to that point. Right now, I want to stay rooted in this universality of grief a little bit longer. So we tend to think that humans are exceptional. And we tend to forget that as humans, we're animals, literally. There are a lot of other animals besides humans that grieve. Birds even grieve. And some of you will probably have seen your house pet grieve. I think we can learn a lot from watching animals grieve. Barbara King is a biological anthropologist who's published this fascinating book. And note, it is not do animals grieve, it is how animals grieve. Some of you will remember this orca mother. In 2018, she made headlines when she carried her 400-pound dead baby orca for 17 days. And this same orca made headlines again this December when her second calf died, and she carried it for 11 days. And now what I find particularly interesting about the stories of animal behavior around death is how their community, their pod, elephant herds will help carry the grief. So for example, in this orca story, the other members of the pod seem to help this mother. They helped feed her. and they helped support the 400-pound baby. Similarly, in reports of elephants, there's herd behavior that's been reported where they'll collectively respond to a matriarch's bones. And chimpanzees, after an important death, the grooming in the social herd or group of chimpanzees will increase. And grooming is a social behavior between chimpanzees. So let's go back to our question about what is grief with that as your background. So I hope that you can see now that grief can be simply defined, and yet buried in the simple definitions is a lot of complexity. So from a simple angle, grief, as I've put here, is the experience of the loss of something that was hoped or expected to continue. Grieving that loss is the expression and manifestation of that experience. So now we have a fairly simple definition, but there's nothing simple about human experience. And perhaps because of this complexity, grief is often misunderstood. And perhaps because of that, it can be feared and it can be stigmatized. So I've been using this word loss, you've probably noted. And as we saw in that hand-raising exercise, loss can be vast. But, and this is key, experiencing the loss, it is about the person who has experienced the loss who determines what is loss and what has been lost. And they are the ones who get to determine if that loss is grievable or not. So bear with me. This is a really important point. So our entry point into grief is that the grief experience is determined by the griever. It is not what was lost. It is how is the loss being experienced. So what was lost? It could be the death of a close relative, could be an animal death, it could be a non-death loss, could be climate change. People are grieving climate change right now. Any and all loss can be grieved, but it might not be. The griever determines if and how they will grieve a loss. So, for example, I have a cat. The cat dies. I'm kind of relieved. The cat I got from an ex. It didn't like me. I didn't like it. It's kind of smelly. Kind of sad that it died, but, you know, good riddance cat. I am not grieving that cat. I had a cat for 18 years. She was a good friend of mine. She helped me through the death of my mother. She was an amazing companion. My house feels really empty now when I go home and she's not there at the door. I'm kind of lonely without her. So the point here is that an outsider's judgment about what counts as loss and what an appropriate response is supremely unhelpful. I have to determine if my cat's death is grievable or not. What you think about cats, not important. What you think about how lonely and lost and sad I am, that's important. That is grief literacy. There's a really important expression that we should take to heart, and it's comparison is the thief of grief. So what does this mean? It means we should never tell a griever that their grief is better or worse than another person's grief. It was just a cat, get over it. No, it wasn't just a cat to me. The worst kind of grief is the grief you're experiencing now. It's not a competition. No one is going to win. So we need to resist this urge to compare grief or compare grievers. No two people will grieve the same loss the same way. I have 3 siblings. We're all grieving my mother, and we're doing it in vastly different ways, and that's completely normal. Similarly, no 2 grief experiences will be the same. I shouldn't try to compare grieving my cat to grieving my grandmother or grieving the climate. With grief, don't look for patterns and don't look for comparisons. Don't try to compare your feelings to another person's feelings. You know, I can't imagine leaving the house, but my brother's out on the golf course. It's not going to get you anywhere. Don't try to compare your feelings of one loss to another. So I cried for my cat. I didn't cry for my uncle. What is wrong with me? Again, not helpful. Trying to compare grief or trying to compare grievers will not help you understand your own grief, nor help you support anyone. Now, I'm going to add a layer to my definition to help us think about how grief affects how we grieve. So as an experience, grief is not just an emotion. It lives in our whole bodies, and that's what this word embodied in red means in the definition. So grief isn't just an emotional response. We grieve with our whole bodies. So note in this image, the griever is trying to deal with the weight of grief. They have a hole through their middle. Their whole body is marked by this hole. Something important is missing in their life. Their knees are trying to help their elbows, help their arms to support their heavy face and their heavy head. Now, as something that lives in our bodies, each person will experience and express grief uniquely. And each time you experience grief, how it shows up in your body will also be unique. Now, as something that lives in our bodies, we feel grief. And this feeling is often conveyed by metaphors like the weight of stones, because grief can feel really heavy. But artists and authors also get at the contradictions in how grief shows up in our bodies. And an example is this quotation from the author Ilan Mastai, who wrote in his debut novel, "People talk about grief as emptiness, but it's not empty, it's full, it's heavy. It's not an absence to fill, it's a weight to pull. Your skin caught on hooks, chained to rough boulders, made of all the futures you thought you would have." So here, grief is being conveyed as an emptiness, and yet it can feel like a heavy fullness. So how can something that is empty feel full? Well, I think this image answers that question. The empty hole is full of heaviness. You can see in this image how grief has changed, how the griever carries their body. They're bent over with the weight of emptiness. A piece is missing, but it still has to be carried with them wherever they go. So as a result, our grieving bodies can feel quite different after we have a loss. They can feel heavy and slow. They can be unreliable. Grievers tend to bump into things. They trip over things. They have car accidents. Our grieving bodies can also be erratic. You may burst into tears when you hear your friend's favorite song. When you smell the perfume that your mother wore, or when you drive past the vet where your cat was last alive. And this means that our activities of daily living, such as getting out of bed, getting dressed, leaving the house, going to the grocery store, going to the synagogue, they can be greatly challenged by the hole and the heaviness that we now have to live with. And grief isn't just in our individual bodies, we feel it in our social bodies. So this is a sculpture in PEI at the International Children's Memorial Place. And that's an organization that focuses on child death and family grief. And here we see that the loss is being depicted as a whole that the entire family has to carry. And the stone in which the whole is carved reproduces this idea of heaviness, but adding to that is permanence. This family will carry that whole forever. Now, this quotation from my own research, I find really kind of underscores how grief is filled with these contradictions. The speaker is a middle-aged gentleman in Italy, and he was speaking about his wife. And he said, "I fell in love with that woman so many times. It's been 5 years since she died. On the calendar, that seems like a long time, but it feels to me like yesterday. My grief is like Swiss cheese. The holes make it beautiful." And in these few sentences, we have so many contradictions. We see how calendar time is not the same as lived time. We see the metaphor of the hole recur, but the holes are not empty. They contain memory. And we also hear deep sadness, but we also hear deep beauty. So the last point I want to make in this section of the talk is how in many of the images that I've shown you, and also in that quotation when I was speaking with that man, the grievers are out in the world. They're not at home. They're not in a therapist's office. They're not cloistered behind closed doors. Like you and like me here, they are out in the world, bringing their grief with them. Because you don't have a choice. You can't carve your grief off and leave it at home. It has to come wherever you go. So with that as a foundation, I'm now going to turn to discuss grief literacy a bit more. And this is a movement to make our communities more attuned to and accepting of grief. So this is the original international group that developed the idea of grief literacy back in 2018. And it includes researchers and practitioners and even a funeral director in the midst. And importantly, while as a group, we didn't coin the term grief literacy, our team was the first to really kind of build a theoretical scaffold to start to give it kind of more robust definition and kind of a holding frame within public health. This was our first pass at writing about the concept. And if anyone is interested in a copy of this paper, send me an email and I can send you a digital copy, no problem. Now, the premise of grief literacy is that, as I've been saying, grief is normal. It's a normal human reaction to meaningful losses. So it's about normalizing something that is universal to humans. But while grief is universal, it's also unique each time it shows up. And while grief is unique to each grief and griever, humans are by nature relational beings. We live in social groups, families, neighborhoods, communities. It is in our social settings, be it the grocery store or the bingo hall, where simple, everyday acts of kindness and compassion can go a long way to supporting grievers and inviting them to feel included. Bring your grief with you. And so grief literacy is aiming to socialize. I said it's aiming to normalize grief, but it's also aiming to socialize it. So bringing grief out into the open, making our social spaces better able to accommodate it so that it can be less hidden, less stigmatized, and ultimately less lonely. Because as many of us here in the room will have experienced, grief can be deeply lonely and deeply isolating. So in order to build grief literacy, there are some persistent myths that have to be dispelled, and I'm going to walk through a few of them. So for example, grief is fickle. It can be both painful and sad, and yet you can also feel joy and laughter when you're grieving. Just because someone's laughing, it doesn't mean they're not grieving. I watched an interview recently with Regina King, who's an American actress, who was talking openly about her son, Ian, who recently died by suicide. And in the interview, she and the interviewer referred to her grief as happy sorrow. So you can hear the contradiction and the fickleness in this phrase, happy sorrow. So King's happiness comes from all the beautiful memories she has with her son. But these memories are not for her buried in the past. She talks about her son in the first person and about how he still brings her laughter and he still brings her joy, even though he has died. And she said, "My favorite thing is being Ian's mom. And it's not that I was Ian's mom, I am Ian's mom." She continues to be Ian's mother, even though he has passed away. So for her, the death didn't end their relationship. It changed it. She is grieving deeply and not but, and smiling and laughing about and with her son. One of the most persistent myths is that there are stages of grief. You've probably heard there's 5 stages of grief. What are they? Denial, bargaining, Sorry, spoiler alert, there are no stages of grief. We want there to be we desperately want there to be, because that would mean it ends. Sorry. There are no stages. It is not linear. It is not a process with a clear path. Some people use this term journey. It's a grief journey. It might be, but it doesn't have an ending. Not one that we can see from this vantage point. There's actually no right way to grieve. People ask all the time, what is the right way to grieve? There is no right way to grieve. The right way to grieve is the way that you are grieving. So however you describe grief, however it works for you, try to avoid putting yourself or anyone on a linear trajectory when they're grieving. Now, another myth is this idea of closure. So if we don't have a linear trajectory, a straight line, grief does not have a clear end point. There's no timeline on it. There's no closure to it. It's not an experience that time will fix. So Ken Burns was a filmmaker, and he was quoted here saying, and this was 56 years after his mother died. He said, the half-life of grief is endless. So a decades-old grief can still feel fresh and painful, and that's completely normal. It doesn't mean you're not grieving well. That's just grief. That's just normal. And passing time can actually make grief feel even more poignant. As Burns says here, I've been without a mother for 56 years. That is way too long. Her name was Lila. 56 years later, it's still important that her name was Lila. The next myth is this idea that you could move on and get over your grief. You can't snap out of it. You can't leave it behind you. You can only move forward with it. And as Louis Tonkin says, people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. In reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly, life begins to grow bigger around it. So we don't move on from grief, we move on with our grief. Grief changes and evolves and grows with us as we change and evolve and grow. And finally, non-grievers can greatly misunderstand what grievers live and what they need. It is not uncommon for people to cross the street, cross the room to avoid having to talk to a griever. We've all done it. And grievers can live this as if people think they're contagious, that they're going to catch it. Non-grievers in this scenario, they don't want to have to imagine themselves being bereaved. They have the there but for the grace of God go I feeling, and they try to avoid being confronted by the possibility of grief. Well, responding to grievers this way stigmatizes them, and it further entrenches the loneliness they're already living. The only way to deal with grief is to grieve. So we should never try to shut down anyone from grieving. So, what do? You've heard me saying there are no stages of grief. There's no timeline on grief. There's no closure from grief. There's no right way to grieve. What in the heck do we do? How can we make grief better and make our communities more grief literate? How can we make Nova Scotia more kind, more compassionate, and more caring when it comes to grief? I have a few suggestions. So one thing we can do is act now. There's no timeline in grief anyway, so now must be good. Why not do it now? Think about the casserole brigade. When you hear about a death, what do? You make a casserole. Pretty lovely, right? How long does it last? A week, 10 days. Condolence cards, they peter out after 2-3 weeks. Workplaces, maybe 3 to 5 days bereavement leave if you're full-time secure worker. Part-time workers, none. Bereavement leave is only for human death, and it has to be a death close to you. You don't get bereavement leave when your cat died. First anniversaries often will be acknowledged. After the first anniversary of the death, not so much. There's kind of an embedded assumption that after a year, you should be over it. But as there's no timeline on grief, we should feel we can always be grief sensitive. There's a podcaster called Lisa Kefauver, and her podcast, excuse me, but it's called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. And she has this motto: show up, shut up, listen, and keep showing up. We need to be listening for hidden grief as well. And I learned this by going to yard sales. Experiencing the death or a major loss, a major transition in your life, it's a common impetus to have a yard sale. I published this article in the Globe and Mail about how we find grief everywhere if we just listen for it. So I walked into a yard on the North Shore of Nova Scotia, yard sale sign, love me a good yard sale. And I saw an older gentleman sitting behind the table with all of his stuff. And I noticed that many of the things on the one particular table was all themed with dogs. Dog this, dog mug, dog plate, dog t-shirt, dog hat. There's a particular kind of dog. It took me less than 30 seconds to elicit from him his grief. Conversation went like this: nice day for a yard sale. Yeah, sure is. You really like dogs. Yeah. We used to have a kennel before my wife died. Last winter, during COVID, she died. Now, in a grief literate world, we don't turn away from this gentleman's story. We lean in. Did your wife like dogs too? What was her name? Tell me about her. You must really miss her. 10-minute conversation. That's all it took. We need to lean into the possibility of grief being under conversations. We need to make time to then listen to those stories. I still have a little dog figurine that I bought from this gentleman, and I keep it in my car to remind me of the lesson that he taught me that day. When you hear about a major loss in your social network, one thing we can do is send a handwritten card, right? This is something that might be intuitive when a person dies. But what about when the cat dies? Do you send a card? Or after the divorce? Or the surgery? And I recently looked back through the piles of cards that my father received after my mother died. Please, if you can, don't just write, "I'm sorry for your loss. My condolences." Try to include an anecdote if you have one. Something like, "I remember the first time I met Betty. It was at a church dance. Wow, did she love to dance. I hope she's dancing now wherever she is." Something little, something sweet, to talk about the legacy of the person and to bring both the tear and the smile to your face, not just the tear. The act of writing a condolence card is an exercise in the inadequacy of language. And this is a teaching moment for ourselves because it forces a reflection on something that is generally deeply uncomfortable. We need to get better at it. So next time you write a condolence card, think about how you're feeling as you write it and sit in that uncomfortableness and try to make it a little bit more normal. It is never too late to send a card. And it's never wrong to admit that you're at a loss for words. Remember, show up, shut up, listen, and keep showing up. And showing up doesn't mean you know what to say. It just means that you're making an effort. If at all possible, minimally say something. Try not to stay silent because silence is lonely. We are all out of our depths with grief, but we still need to try. You'll never get it 100% right, but the worst thing you can do is to stay silent. So proceed with kindness and humility. You can try phrases like, "That sounds difficult," and then ask, "How are you doing?" This helps to make it about them, and it allows them to space to say, "Actually, I'm fine. I didn't like that cat." Or to say, "I'm finding it really hard. I miss that cat." We should generally avoid phrases like, "I'm sorry for your loss." When I hear that, I'm like, well, which of my million losses are you sorry for? It's a nice sentiment, but can we be a little bit more specific? My personal favorite is, "That really sucks." Because it does. That sounds hard. That sounds difficult. How are you? They might be fine, and they might not be. We have to let them tell us. We should avoid phrases like, "Oh, I can't imagine what you're going through." Because yes, we can, we just don't want to. And this makes it about us. I can't imagine what you're going through. It's about me, not about you. And it can leave people feeling like an alien. If you can't imagine it, who can imagine it? Also, phrases like, I know how you feel. No, you don't. And comparing your own grief to their grief also makes it about you. When you're fresh into grief, you probably don't know what you need. And we shouldn't impose on the griever to tell us what they need or what to do. You know, call me if you need anything. Instead, we should just show up. Call them, write them, drop by if you can, bring flowers, bring food, ask them if they want company, invite them to share a meal, offer to walk their dog with them. They might say, no, thank you. Thank you very much. That's very nice of you. Okay, that's fine. But they might not. And when you do show up, we need to shut up. We need to listen to whatever they want to talk about. Yeah, we heard the story about the cat over and over. We've heard it a few times. So, suck it up. If they're telling it over and over, it's because they need to tell it over and over. And we need to keep showing up. Do it again. Do it again. If they tell you to go home, go home. Try again later. Maybe they're open to it, maybe they're not, but you have to try. We need to reflect on a little bit on our language too. There are phrases that are trotted out in an effort to soothe grievers, but actually they're more about soothing us than they are about soothing the grievers. So please understand that these phrases can fundamentally misunderstand what grief is and can be deeply offensive and deeply hurtful. So, for example, you should never tell a person who had a miscarriage, well, at least you can try to have another baby. You should never tell a bereaved spouse they need to be strong for the children, and you should never tell the children they need to be brave for their parents. These are gestures that are trying to soothe us, the non-grievers, from witnessing displays of grief. We cannot fix anyone's grief. The only way with grief is grieving, so we should never try to shut down someone's grief. And my last point here is a positive, grief-attuned response is being curious and listening. When you ask questions, listen and log the response so that when you show up the next time, you already have that information. Our questions should focus on the person or the thing that was lost, not on how they died or how it was lost. Tell me about your Nana. What was it like to live in Syria? What was your cat's name? When you see someone with a new tattoo or someone who wears the same jewelry all the time, ask about it. You might learn that that necklace actually has cremation ashes in it. This image on the slide is from my team's research in Ontario. This couple's son died, and to honor him, they both got tattoos. On the 5th anniversary of the death, a number of family members got matching tattoos. And on the 10th anniversary, the father got another tattoo, all commemorating the son. This final slide is an invitation to visit this national nonprofit organization that I co-founded. We're working to advance grief literacy, education, and advocacy for all things grief. And I invite you to have a look and sign up for our monthly newsletter. And with that, I just want to thank you for your kind attention and invite you to refreshments. Very much needed break, I'm sure. Refreshments at the back, and then we'll come back together and have a Q&A.
Thanks very much. First of all, thank you so much, Mary Ellen. It was a tremendous talk and outline and experience. I don't know, it's going to take a long time to process it. But one question I had, you talked about as I call it, the universality of grief and how it matters. Is it not, I mean, and now in our case, we have more and more friends or people that we've lost or are losing. Do you find that our sense of grief over time changes? It may not be the same, but it still is something that changes as we get older, as we become more mature, as we experience more. Is that something you've seen in terms of the experience of grief?
Yeah, I think I would say yes and no. It's a good answer. I feel like a politician. Yes and no. I think there's something, the familiarity, right? Like you recognize it. Maybe the first time you experience grief, you don't recognize it. And you don't know that it's going to stay with you, and you don't know how it's going to evolve and all of those sort of things. So there's something familiar about it. But there's also something like, I'm not again. Like, am I not done? That was exhausting. Like the grief that I went through for X, Y, or Z was exhausting. Like, do I really have to do that again? And I think that's where grief literacy is so important, because yeah, you do. Because you're human, and because you love, and because you care. So yeah, that's kind of the price you're going to pay for loving and caring, which, but I think it just is. And the fact that we're not talking about it and that we're surprised by it is where we're doing ourselves a disservice. It's just human. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you presented to children in schools as a way to start grief literacy early in our lives? Are there grief literacy courses, programs in schools?
Lovely question. Lovely question. There's a whole movement called Compassionate Schools. And it is about not so much here locally. It's an international movement. Scotland has some really lovely models of compassionate schools. I don't know of anything explicitly here where it's a formal program, but I heard this lovely example the other day of a woman whose mother had died. And so she went to the funeral in New Brunswick, and she brought her young child with her. And so the child missed some school. She then brought the child back to school, and the teacher, she had to meet the teacher to say, sorry, my son missed some school. And the teacher gave her a button that she could put on her child's backpack. So when the child was having a particularly griefy day, just stick it on the backpack and the teacher would know. And the teacher would then be attentive to this child. I thought, wow, that's so simple. That is so beautiful. But that's a grief literate teacher, right? And we can't, we know our teachers, lots of our teachers are not grief literate. They've just not had the training, right? And had the kind of ability to prioritize it. But this was a grief literate teacher. And this was such a beautiful example of why we need to be, teachers need in-services on grief literacy, but also to the point in the question, children, they're exposed to death, but we try to protect them. Don't take the child to the funeral. Oh my, and I remember not being able to go to my grandmother's funeral because children didn't go to funerals. I'm married to an Italian gentleman who has been like dealing with death for his entire life because they just talk about death all the time. Like the number of dead bodies he's seen is incredible just because it's much more. They're so comfortable talking about death in his particular Italian circle. So those contrasts, I think with children, daycares, we need to be talking about death, you know, so many teachable moments. The goldfish dies. Don't rush out and get a new goldfish and replace it and don't tell the child, which is what happens. Let's have a little funeral for the goldfish, right? Simple things. But also I know in our schools, I probably shouldn't say this, but the children in the schools require parents' permission for a lot. And some parents are not comfortable. And I can think of an example in this province where there is an activity that is a grief literate activity. And the youth who are in high school have to get parents' permission in order to go to that activity. And it's just part of the normal curriculum. And, you know, lots of parents will say, absolutely, yes, that's wonderful, right? But I think the youth need to be able to make those kinds of decisions as well. But that's a whole other sidebar. But I absolutely think, I mean, we can learn so much from children. We can learn from children as they're being exposed to death, dying, and loss. We can learn from them. So yeah, absolutely. To answer that question in a really roundabout way.
Is your group lobbying to develop a curriculum for is your group or any group in Nova Scotia lobbying, pushing to develop grief courses for the elementary school segment, junior high and senior high? Is there anything going on to push for this? Because you're quite right, it needs to happen.
Yeah. We're definitely working right across all the age spectrum. And so we have studies on youth grief. We're working with Nova Scotia Health to launch an app so that you'll have a resource on your phone. Youth will have a resource on their phones. Like, where are the resources near me? Like, you know, what library has a peer group? What, you know, what church organization has a group that I could go to? So we're working on that. Absolutely. But I mean, there's so much, like, as I say, as a researcher, it's a good problem. There's so much to do. Yeah.
Since we know that grief doesn't ever end, as you pointed out in a number of different ways, but we also, I think, know that there are cases in which people can be pathologically stuck at a certain point in their grief, and so they can't move on. And I don't mean by that forget it, but continue to live a healthy mental and spiritual life. So you haven't made any comments about that kind of situation, so I'd be interested in your comments.
Yeah, it's a really important point. There's something called the public health model of bereavement support. And like a lot of public health things, it's a nice big triangle. And so the top of the triangle are the people who are, as you're saying, are stuck. And they do have a diagnosable pathological response to grief. It's called prolonged grief disorder. So they're at risk at the top of this triangle. And then there's the middle block that would be moderately at risk. And then the bottom block that's very, very low risk. And so what this group in Australia that designed this triangle based upon empirical research, what they found was, for the most part, over 90% of people are in the bottom and the middle tier of that triangle. There's 10% that are at the top who are at risk for what's called prolonged grief disorder. And very, very important to be attentive to that 10%. At the same time, we're really good at focusing on pathology, right? So those 10% need psychiatry, they need psychology, they need professionals. Over 90% in this triangle do not. So there's a middle chunk of 30% that do really well with peer-to-peer kinds of activities, like going to the local hospice where they have peer groups that are run from, widows who are talking to widows, right? Or people whose child has died talking to people whose child has died. And those kind of peer-to-peer support groups work really well for that middle 30%. The 60% at the bottom do okay just with time. They have a supportive spouse. They have a supportive teacher. They have a supportive rabbi. Whatever it is, they do well without overly professionalizing it, psychologizing it, psychiatrizing it, medicalizing it, because it's just normal. So I always feel it's important to make sure we're covering the whole triangle. But I think we tend to historically focus on those who are sick, when grief is not for over 90% of people. It's not a sickness, it's not an illness. So it's really important from this kind of public health place to be responsibilizing all of us to care for all of us. But thank you for that question.
Who in the world is doing the best job? Is there a country who you would hold up as a model? Like,
Yeah.
I just thought my old broadcasting voice would carry. I'm just curious, who in the world, what country or countries are doing a good job of what you've been talking about? Is there somebody that we here in Nova Scotia, Canada, can hold up as a model and say, we should aim to be like that country in doing those types of programs?
I think actually Nova Scotia is punching above its weight. Yeah. I think Nova Scotia is doing an incredible job. Unfortunately, I hate that word, but because of the mass casualty, money has come into the province to make right what was wrong, kind of thing. And they're being very careful and very attentive and very thoughtful about what this grief thing, what this bereavement thing even is, how to be attentive. They're approaching it with a public health framework, with a public health perspective. They're being very thoughtful about it. So I would say, like in Canada, there's a bright light shone on Nova Scotia. Yes. Yeah. Question over there. Yeah.
A few things. Has there been more people stuck at that peak in your pyramid post-COVID? And another thing is families have changed a lot.
Yeah.
Very few kids per family, very few cousins, fewer aunts and uncles.
Yeah.
How have those things changed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly post-COVID, that has been looked at, kind of the rates of prolonged grief disorder post-COVID. And I do believe there was kind of a bump. I can't give you the exact stats on that. We are taking right now, I'm with a group that is trying to reproduce that triangle for Canada. And it will be, so in Australia, it came out before the pandemic. In Canada, we also have an opioid crisis. We also have residential schools being discovered, and we are post-COVID. So we are trying to reproduce the Australian data to see what it looks like in Canada. So we'll be able to answer that a little bit later, hopefully. As for the family structure, that's a really hard question, because I don't want to it's really easy to kind of look back at the romantic old days when everyone, sung Kumbaya and walked around the corpse in the living room or something. And people do kind of prop up those kind of images where like in the halcyon days, we knew about death and we've forgotten about death now. And I'm not 100% sure that's actually true. I mean, we all stumble forward in our own ways. And so, yeah, maybe we don't have family, but maybe we have friends, or maybe, you know, maybe our teachers are a little bit more aware these days than they used to be. So I can't really answer that question. Do you have a theory about it, or do you have a concern about it? Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. But meanwhile, our planet's going down the toilet. So there's other things we can grieve. There's always, you know, there's always something we could grieve. But it's an interesting point. Yeah, yeah. But I think at the same time now, we also have pets that are family members, and they didn't used to be family members the way they now are family members. So when a pet dies now, it's, you know, you are losing a family member because we have embraced them, and that kind of social structure didn't really exist before. So food for thought, yeah.
Thinking about Ukraine and Palestine and
Yeah.
Syria, and I'm thinking that that doesn't fit into your,
Yeah.
into the model with
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah. It doesn't.
What happens?
Yeah.
In those situations, what can be done
Yeah.
at the local level
Yeah.
in those countries?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And good for you to note that the triangle is bereavement. So it is after a human death specifically. So that's the public health model of bereavement support, is for human death. The triangle that would be grief more broadly, no one's drawn that triangle, right? But you're absolutely right that people on the ground are carrying that grief. People who are 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degrees removed from what's happening in those countries, also carrying lots of different kinds of grief. What to do about it? Talk. That's the first thing you can do about it. Some people want to respond with political activism. That's one way to respond to it. Personal activism, like what are the products you're buying? Where are you giving your, you know, any disposable income you have, where are you giving it? And then, you know, broader things like marches and that sort of thing. I think in terms of the grief, it's about naming it as grief, because I think we don't do a good job of recognizing what is grief and what is something else, and actually using it. Can be very kind of liberating on a personal level to start using this language of grief to actually name what it is that you're carrying and you're feeling.
Can I ask a further question? And what is?
Yeah.
Thank you. What is the UN doing? What are what is in place in refugee camps? What is in place in Canada when people come from those war-torn countries?
Nothing.
Thank
I
you.
would think very, very little. I would assume very, very little. It's kind of, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where does grief fit on Maslow's hierarchy of need? Like food, shelter, clothing, psychological, mental wellness. The other thing in those scenarios too is we have to be careful, because there's a trauma and then there's grief, and they overlap, but they're not the same thing, right? So in that, I mean, the situations that you're bringing up, there's a lot of necessity to focus on trauma. Where trauma is, there is grief. Where grief is, there's not necessarily trauma, right? So the Venn diagram is incredibly important in that situation. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. When you know that somebody is going to take MAID in the future, it's very difficult to have a conversation with that person and ongoing. Your grief becomes complicated in that respect, does it? How do you approach that?
Are you talking about the person who's dying their grief, or the family member who's talking to them?
Both. They're not. they're quite content with the choice they've made.
Okay, okay. So it's a family member's
Yes.
grief that's a big one. The big one. I mean, that's an important anticipatory. There's this language, anticipatory grief, right? I don't like getting caught up in some of those labels. Like, to me, grief is grief is grief. But sometimes they're very helpful to label it and carve it out and say, well, that's anticipatory grief because you are grieving something that is coming down the road, right? That you know it's coming and you're already grieving it. So you're anticipating this thing, but at the same time, you are in the here and now and you are grieving it, right? And you could also be grieving something about the relationship with this person where, you know, whatever that conversation was and the tension and how it can get really messy and sticky can be a place for grief as well. Oh yeah, there's another question. Was it specific to this topic or? Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
follow-up
Yeah,
about the
okay.
previous question.
Okay.
I've had recent experience with families whose one member of the family has chosen maid.
Yeah.
And in one case, shortly after that, a second member of the family also chose maid.
Yeah.
And in each case, the person who administered the maid was the same person. And it has struck me that when we have a family member who dies in a non-maid environment, that's what has always happened for human beings. We never know when our mother or our father is going to die, to the minute, to the second, to the day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
knowing it and knowing exactly when it's going to happen is an indescribable situation. I can't find any words for it.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it affects grief because we're used to shocking grief, not grief that is programmed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think MAID is kind of one of these, it's a new grief that people are just starting to understand for all of the reasons that you point out. I've certainly seen literature from some people who found the MAID, like the survivors, the family members, found the MAID very comforting because it allowed them to say goodbye. It allowed them, it wasn't that shocking thing. Like they knew it was coming, so they could prepare, and it gave them comfort because the person who then died was able to pick their music and what they were going to wear and what day it was. And so there was some sort of comfort that came. But then how it actually affects the person who's left behind, that's a whole other thing. So you can feel like you were able to give this person what they wanted. So there's something lovely about that. But then what you still have lost something so precious to you. So I don't really know what to say.
My oldest friend chose maid about a year ago. And I was halfway across the country when all of this happened. But I spoke to her each of the 3 days and the day of, within an hour of when the doctor came, whoever came. And I would say my experience of it was that I was very happy that she had come to the place where she could make this decision for herself.
Yeah.
I just felt so good that she was empowered to not have to suffer anymore.
Yeah.
Because she could hardly breathe and she was just fighting to breathe for months.
Yeah.
And then when it had happened, it wasn't any different than if she had died and I hadn't known that she was going to die, you know, at that particular time. I would say. Now that doesn't mean it's going to be that way for everyone, but that's how it was for me. It was not, it did not make it a negative at all. I mean, obviously I didn't want to lose her, but I was so happy that she didn't have to suffer anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly there's lots of stories like yours where it's a gift. Of course, there's, you know, each grief is unique. Each griever is unique. There's lots of stories where it certainly didn't feel like a gift. And especially in some cultural or religious traditions where people then feel ostracized, people lose their whole church. They can't talk about what happened. They have to be very secretive. Don't put it in the obituary, you know, because you can't have the church community hear what happened in your family, or your cultural community can't find out what happened in your family because they're going to feel like you gave up or da da da. Like there's lots and lots of stigma still attached to maids. So, I mean, I think it is a beautiful thing if you can walk away from it and feel at peace with it, but not everybody can. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
There's a question online, actually not a question,
Okay.
but a comment.
Okay.
It's coming from a person from the Alzheimer Society of Nova Scotia. They thank you for the presentation and simply want to point out that the society has a program which will start soon called Grief Support Program for Persons who are caregivers to people living with dementia. So this is support services for caregivers, which will be coming soon.
Lovely. Lovely. Thank you very much for pointing that out. That's incredibly important. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is everyone exhausted?
I am not exhausted. I'm overwhelmed. I'm sure you can feel from the response in this room that people just, just loved your presentation, just gained so much insight. And our lives are better for what you have said. A number of people spoke to me during the break, and they talked about just the way you presented. You made this all, we can talk about grief now. But you'll be interested to know there's a woman who left early at break because she's writing a book on her husband's death, and she wants to incorporate a number of points that she heard today. So she didn't want to miss the second part, but she didn't want to forget anything that she had learned today. So anyway, I cannot thank you enough. This was, so many of us, we've had our own personal grief. We tried to work with friends who are suffering, and you have helped us all. So thank you very, very much.